And I really was looking forward to actually being in Middlebury, but this is the next best thing. And I'm just delighted to be here with you tonight. And, let me tell you, a couple of years ago, it was 2 years ago that Nancy and I finished the manuscript to this book. A lot of people are saying The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. And as we were sending the manuscript into the press, we looked at each other and said, what happens if this all kind of disappears by the time the book comes out? And we really thought that was a possibility. And we thought, well, it'll be bad for our book, but it'll be good for the country. So let's see what happens. Well, here we are 2 years later. And just today in the New York Times, every day now, conspiracy theorizing, conspiratorial allegations, it is a whiteout blizzard. They happen every hour of the day. And it's not going away anytime soon. Just Monday, when Trump appeared, as soon as he appeared, there were conspiratorial allegations being, just flooding social media. As soon as he reported that he was COVID positive, there were allegations that he was faking that. A firm that tracks social media, misinformation on social media, noted that I think as of Monday or Tuesday, the charge that he had been faking coronavirus was repeated almost 100,000 times. And that's the whole idea of the title. A lot of people are saying what's happening with the conspiratorial thinking that's in our public life today is that repetition is substituting for validation. Old-fashioned validation required opening your eyes to evidence, gathering evidence. It was almost like the old-time conspiracy theorist was like an investigative journalist who went out there and tried to uncover the cover-up by finding the facts that were being withheld and connecting the dots to reveal a pattern and exposing that pattern to the world in order to hold the powerful to account and defend the cause, usually of the people, of democracy. And some conspiracy theories, of course, are true. Just because something's a conspiracy theory doesn't mean that it's sort of cognitively defective or obviously wrong. Take the Pentagon Papers, which the New York Times published. This was an internal Pentagon report, which detailed the truth about how things were going in Vietnam during the war and made clear that the Pentagon was conspiring to deceive the American people about the state of progress in the Vietnam War. Conspiracy theory, and a true one, justified by the evidence that was eventually revealed. Even conspiracy theories that I don't take to be very convincing in the least, sometimes take that form. Like, I think there's still a website out called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And this is part of the idea that the United States government was in on the planning of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11, 2001. In that website, there's an effort to excavate arguments from engineering about, the rate at which steel melts under certain kinds of temperature in order to kind of argue that jet fuel couldn't have been sufficient to take down the World Trade Centers and that explosives had to be hidden in the building. The very title, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, gestures to the authority of experts, the authority of architects and engineers and people who know something about structural science. And so again, that may not be a very convincing conspiracy theory, but think about it. It tries to adduce facts. It explains an event that everyone acknowledged happened in the world, and it was an event that was really hard to make sense of. 19 people with very, very little in the way of resources, plotting from the sands of Afghanistan, successfully attacked the United States of America. Such a puny cause, such a massive effect. It doesn't seem possible. And what the conspiracy theory did was put a cause in that was just as weighty as the effect. The United States government, that's a powerful cause. That had to be part of the reason, part of the planning, Now we can explain such a world historical effect. So it actually was an effort to make sense of a world, at least gesturing toward the realm of facts and arguments. That's not what I see in QAnon or Pizzagate. To some extent, Pizzagate was the thing that got Nancy and me going. We thought, wow, this is really something very, very different. It doesn't start from an event. What's the event that it's trying to explain? Well, Pizzagate, by the way, is the narrative that charges that Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman, John Podesta, were running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizzeria outside Washington, D.C. I think the pizzeria is called Comet Ping Pong. And by the way, there's one gentleman, Edgar Welch, who so believed this allegation that he showed up at the pizzeria, which really exists, with an assault rifle, caused mayhem as he entered into the premises and fired the assault rifle at a locked door in the back of the premises, expecting to be liberating a bunch of children who were being held captive. He found a closet full of flour. The children, according to the narrative, were being held in the basement. There is no basement. The thing is built on a slab. So this is a concoction that doesn't start from an event. It doesn't explain something about the world, and it doesn't adduce any facts. It doesn't even make an effort to. It's sheer fabulation from beginning to end. And it, in fact, makes the world a much weirder place. It's quite disorienting, and it gets its power not because it persuades by reference to facts and arguments, but just because it gets repeated. It gets retweeted, it gets forwarded, it gets liked. And through that repetition, it starts to seem plausible. And if enough people are saying it, then it seems justifiable to send it on. Well, I don't know if it's true, but a lot of people are saying it. And that means that it's true enough for me to repeat, for me to send it to you. And so the standard true enough replaces the standard of truth. We no longer ask, is it true? Do I believe it? We just ask, is it true enough for me to retweet it? And that's a much, much lower standard that lets just about anything in. And take the other really strange conspiratorial concoction, QAnon. QAnon actually appeared just as Nancy and I were finishing the book. And we were fascinated with it. We were on 4chan, which was the message board where QAnon was being worked out. And we were on 8chan, where I think it got moved to 8chan after it got kicked off 4chan, if I'm remembering correctly. And the New York Times now sort of describes QAnon as if you could describe it. It says, in today's paper, it says, QAnon is the allegation that the world is controlled by a cabal of satanic pedophiles. Well, it's not anywhere near, that's pretty wackadoo, but it's not even that coherent. What QAnon arose in the summer of 2018 as a reaction to the Mueller investigation of Donald Trump. And the presupposition of QAnon was that there was a well-placed person in the federal bureaucracy, Q, who knew what was really going on and was letting the truth out with these little crumbs that he would distribute, which could be analyzed and interpreted by the cognoscenti, the people in the know. And what Q was communicating quietly was that the Mueller investigation was a ruse, that it was a fake investigation designed to deflect attention to what was really going on, which was an investigation of a whole range of liberal globalists, running from Hillary Clinton to George Soros to Barack Obama, and an apocalyptic moment at which Trump would indict these globalists who were also engaging in child sex trafficking all at once, and they would all be arrested and all be imprisoned. And in this apocalyptic moment, the world would be cleansed of this evil. That was basically the architecture of QAnon, But because I don't even want to call it a theory, it's conspiracy without the theory. There's no theory. There's no explanation of anything. It's just a wild set of narratives. It's a concoction. It's a mashup of separate. They even had JFK Jr. rising from the dead on this apocalyptic moment. I don't know. Was he going to retake power or present himself as a savior in American politics? But even he appeared. Even Pizzagate was sort of mashed up into the QAnon thing. And as we were reading about it, we were struck by its participatory nature. There was no one source for QAnon. There were lots of people jumping on these message boards, participating in the discussion, offering, crumbs, and then trying to interpret them with other people. And some of the interpretations get batted down, and some would get picked up and carried along by others. And we thought to ourselves that we really better not put this in the book, because something this wacky would surely just disappear. And if we made a big deal about it in the book, it would look like we were just kind of picking examples from the fringes of politics. And we had a long discussion about whether to include it. And in the end, we decided, we have a page or two about it, but we really expected that by the time our book would be read, no one would know what QAnon was. And we were using it to illustrate something, but we didn't want to do a full-scale investigation of it because we thought it'd be ephemeral and it would disappear. Well, here we are. And now we have someone who's going to be going to Congress, who is an affiliate, a believer, I don't know quite what to say, of QAnon. And we even see QAnon appearing in other countries. It's in Germany. But it's a vital force in American politics. And just in the last week, Facebook announced that it's going to be ramping up its gatekeeping function to try to shut down pages that propagate the QAnon conspiracy. And so it's in a way more vital than ever. And
Russell?
Yes.
How do they keep track of believers and people who, how do we get numbers, and how do we know how big it is and where it is? How do people know this information?
We don't really. I mean, we know there's algorithms that can determine how many times a certain kind of thing gets tweeted, a certain hashtag gets tweeted or retweeted. And there are algorithms that Facebook has to determine how many pages might mention something like QAnon. So if there's a direct mention of it, it can be tracked by these algorithms. But it's a good question, how do we know how many people believe it? So you can do a poll or a survey and word it appropriately and say, is something like this allegation that, Hillary, do you think it's plausible that Hillary Clinton participates in child sex trafficking? And you can get a number back from the survey. And that one doesn't have huge numbers, but some of the other conspiratorial allegations that we've seen in American politics in recent years do get really large numbers, like the birther conspiracy. And there was a certain point when almost a majority of Republicans professed to believe that Barack Obama was born outside of the United States and therefore was constitutionally ineligible to hold the presidential office. And that's the conspiracy, by the way, that Donald Trump cut his teeth on. So, you could do a poll. You can count up the number of pages on this or that medium. But the interesting thing in your question, Renee, is about what people actually believe. And I think that what's going on as we move from a world of truth to a world of true enoughness is that the question of what people believe is no longer the right question. It's more about what people are willing to repeat and what they're willing to assent to. So I don't know that it's the case that as a set of, I know it's the people who identify with QAnon, could really even describe what the theory says. And if they can't describe what it says, then they certainly don't believe it. I think it's more like an affiliation, almost like a tribal identity. And it's almost like the way people in certain parts of New England identify with the Red Sox. And they're not undertaking like a study to find out what, Major League Baseball team is the most worthy team to support. they identify with it because it's in some sense theirs, and it goes along with Red Sox Nation, which is kind of parts of New England outside Connecticut, and I think it's something like that. It's like to identify with Q is to reveal yourself to be somebody who doesn't buy into the mainstream media, who's suspicious of elites, who's suspicious of science, and who has a certain amount of trust in Donald Trump. And so I think it's now that kind of thing. It's not like a belief; it's more like a belonging. And so if we did a poll, say, do you believe this or that? I'm not sure it would get at what's really happening, which is that it's a kind of tribal belonging. And so let me just take your question and pivot back to Pizzagate, and try to say something about what Pizzagate's doing in the world right now, or what it did in the world. It's still kind of out there. It's not explaining something. It's not explaining something like how a huge power could be, losing a war in Vietnam when it seemed like we were winning, and all the news for so many years said it was winning. It's not explaining how a tiny little cause like a lone gunman could kill the United States president, the most protected person in the world. It's not explaining a real event. What it's doing is painting Hillary Clinton as the concentration of pure evil. If you would sexually traffic in children, if you would sell children for sexual services, you would be as bad as a human being could possibly be. I think it's arguable that you'd be worse than a Nazi, at least as bad. And if that's how you understand, if we can make somebody understand their opponent in politics as not just mistaken, but as evil, then we erase all doubt and all ambiguity. And so, for instance, if you had some reservations about Donald Trump because you noticed certain flaws about him, you might no longer care about those flaws and no longer feel ambivalent, I should say, in your support, because he's running against somebody who's pure evil. And so it functions to support a kind of partisan posture in politics and to erase all doubt and all uncertainty. And, what I would say, I guess, as a citizen, as a teacher of politics, is that in politics, there's the whole truth is never on one side of a question. That's why politics is so hard. And that's why we, good people in good faith with access to the same information end up disagreeing a lot about practical questions and political questions, because it's like the truth is distributed, 49-51. And even if it's distributed 60-40, that's still, it might be hard to make the decision. You might not know. And so even when we stand for things, I think a reasonable person knows that they might be wrong, that they think they're right, but they might be wrong. And so we stand, but we don't stand unflinchingly. And we stand for something, but we also tolerate the opposition. Because we know we're not 100% right about everything all the time, when we lose an election, we don't take up violence. We allow the other side to step into office peacefully. When an incumbent loses an election, the incumbent walks away peacefully, turns over the keys to the office. When somebody wins an election, they don't use the power of their office to persecute their opponent, to send their opponent to the tower, to be imprisoned and executed. So that's the sort of moral truth of democracy, where we contest with each other peacefully and we allow for the peaceful alternation of power. Pizzagate interrupts that. It creates a lot more certainty than we generally are allowed to have in politics, and it creates a situation where one side is all good, the other side is entirely evil. And it does that for the purpose, I think, of shoring up and increasing support for one side. It has a kind of a partisan purpose. And let me just kind of finish by mentioning another conspiracy that's been, repeated and propagated, and was just repeated a lot last week in the debate, but which first came up in the 2016 presidential election, then was repeated in the 2018 midterms. This conspiratorial allegation is summarized in one word: rigged, exclamation point, that the election is rigged. And there was this kind of odd moment after the 2016 presidential election when I don't remember anyone disputing that Donald Trump won the election under the rules, the constitutional rules by which presidential elections take place in the United States of America. And he did, however, lose the popular vote, but the rules of the game don't require that the winner of the office also have the largest popular vote. That'd be an entirely different set of rules. So such as it was, he got to be president. But he couldn't bear the fact that he lost the popular vote. He couldn't bear that bad fact. And so he created a conspiratorial allegation that erased that bad fact. Rigged. The election was rigged. And actually, the election, he argued, was rigged in the state of New Hampshire, where I live right now. He also said it was rigged in California. And I think, the story kind of went that busloads of fraudulent voters came up from Massachusetts to vote in New Hampshire. I mean, this is on its face. If you've ever, anyone in Vermont or New Hampshire knows how preposterous this is. Because, when you go to the polls in these small towns, everybody knows everybody. And if a bus pulls up and lets out hundreds of voters who don't live in town, who are impersonating, whatever, people who are on the checklist, people are going to know. So it was a preposterous allegation. And he repeated it in the 2018 midterms. And now he's been saying since June, he's been tweeting, and he's been saying, and he said it just as directly as it's possible to say in the debate last week, that the coming election is going to be riddled with fraud. And that there's basically a conspiracy to defraud him of his rightful votes that's already taking place. And of course, this is why the title of our book says The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy, because just as something like Pizzagate converts your political opponent into an enemy whom you no longer will tolerate peacefully in the contest of democratic politics, so rigged causes people to lose confidence in the electoral process. And the worry that I think is widely shared right now is that people will believe that the election is rigged, and that if Trump loses the election, especially if the results are close, people will not concede that defeat, and that a certain number of his supporters might take to the streets. So that's how this kind of conspiracism. It's not the conspiratorial theorizing that tried to make sense of stuff that was hard to understand, that sometimes was true, that sometimes was far-fetched. This is something different. There's no evidence. There's no argument. There's no event that's trying to be explained. It's really about pursuing the partisan fight in a way that undercuts the basic norms, of democracy. And let me just end by saying that the very most basic norm, as I've just mentioned, is the willingness of power holders who lose an election to walk away peacefully and to concede. And the example of this, the first time this happens in American politics, as you know, is the election of 1800, when the incumbent president, John Adams, loses to Thomas Jefferson, who's been machinating to defeat him the whole time he's been president. And John Adams walks away. And he doesn't try to imprison Thomas Jefferson or his supporters. He, in a way, follows the example of Washington, what Washington did after 2 terms, walked away. The next time that happens in American politics isn't until, I'm going to guess, 1828, when poor John Adams' son has to do the same thing. John Quincy Adams, 1-termer, loses to, I'm going to say, Andrew Jackson, correct me in chat if I'm wrong, and walks away. And then it becomes a little bit of a pattern. And you could say it's now a norm that the incumbent office holder will walk away and concede. And this is why, we could say that one of the great contributions to constitutional democracy has been made by like the one-term presidents. George Herbert Walker Bush walks away. And I think one of the great contributions was made by Al Gore when, after the contested Florida result came in and Bush v. Gore was announced, he concedes. He has all sorts of bases, legal and political, to continue fighting, but he doesn't. He concedes and walks away. So this is the most fundamental norm of democratic politics, and it's along with some other key norms, what's being just directly attacked by the conspiracism of the moment. And so the question is, what can we do about it? And let me just mention one thing that I thought would happen when we wrote the book. It's in the book. We thought that Republican officials would stand up to Trump's conspiracism and refute it and thus contain its force. We fully thought that to be the case. One of the reasons we thought that is because conspiratorial thinking has always been the province of the outsider in politics. It's what those who are on the periphery, those who are locked out of power, take recourse to in order to understand, make sense of the power elite that they have no connection to and can't control. There's a book called American Conspiracy Theories by two phenomenal social scientists. It's only printed maybe, 2014, and there's a whole chapter in it called Conspiracy Theories Are for Losers. And it's a little brutal, the title, but basically means for those who are locked out of status, of access to resources, of access to power. So to see a conspiracy, someone with a conspiratorial mindset move into the White House is really something new. And I don't think it's ever happened in our history. And that's why we expected that Republicans in the Senate, in Congress, in governorships would simply refute some of the conspiratorial allegations that come out on Trump's Twitter feed. That began when he said that the National Park Service was conspiring to make his inaugural crowd look smaller than it actually was. That was like on day one of his presidency. And we were wrong. We were wrong. It's as if the the Republican Party has just gone mute and supine in the face of Trump. I guess Trump just has such a hold with that primary electorate that Republican officials are not willing to refute him. So that is not part of the solution. We thought it would be, and it isn't. I also think that I have two more suggestions for solutions. One is I have a lot of confidence that reality can bite back. That these conspiratorial, stories, narratives, concoctions are so fabulous. They're so fantastic. They're so strange. That people's common sense, which is to say our access to a world available to the senses that we have in common, that we see and feel and walk through, that people's common sense will inoculate them against these preposterous allegations. And I haven't yet lost confidence in common sense. I do think that if there is no common sense, if we, the people, don't have access to a shared world of facts and events through our senses that supplies us with practical judgment, if we don't have that, if the multiplicity of information sources and authorities in the new information landscape means that we no longer have access to a common world of facts and events, then I actually just don't think democracy is going to survive. I think it's going to be replaced by some form of authoritarianism. Thomas Paine, that wrote the pamphlet that liberated the United States from Great Britain and inaugurated the democratic project in North America, the pamphlet's called Common Sense. And there's no democracy that works without it. So if we don't have it, it's just not going to work. I have to believe that we still have it, and that it's being assaulted, but that the reality is going to bite back. And the last thing I want to say, Renee and Johnny, is as a way of, answering this problem. I think that rather than take it on directly, rather than have some solution that just addresses this problem, here's another solution that might just address this problem, is reviving a little bit of the gatekeeping function in the new media. In the old media, which is, let's say, radio, TV, newspapers, there were gatekeepers. There were editors, the newspaper, who decided what got into those valuable column inches in the newspaper. And if you're spreading fantastic stories that had no basis in fact, the newspaper editors would say, we're not going to print this, it's too nutty. Same thing with producers who were charged with determining what went on over the air. And that gatekeeping function has been obliterated by the new communication technology that sort of amazingly allows anybody to say anything to the entire world for free. It's just an amazing fact to me still, because I can remember, back in graduate school trying to communicate with, people in my neighborhood about some public issue. And I would sneak into a building at night and use the copy machine and make, 500 copies of a pamphlet. We'd fold it, we'd stuff it into envelopes and dress them and, put stamps on it. It cost a fortune just to communicate with 500 people. And now you can communicate with 7 billion people for free. So that means every wackadoo notion out there can get repeated, can get access, can get disseminated for free, and then can get repeated. And there's no gatekeeping function. And we're seeing right now Facebook trying to recreate that gatekeeping function. By the way, YouTube a few years ago said, you know what, we're not going to give a platform to Alex Jones, this renowned conspiracist who said that the children in Newtown, Connecticut, who were shot and killed were actors. The whole thing was staged in order to advance the gun control agenda of liberals. And after that obscenity, YouTube said, we're not giving this guy a platform anymore. And his reach, by the way, has been severely constricted ever since, and his authority has diminished to just a minuscule fraction of what it used to be. So the gatekeeping function can work. We just haven't figured out how to make it work with the new technology. But here's what I think we're really going to need. I think we're going to need a wholesale renovation of democratic institutions to put them into a form that people can believe in. Right now, my students, they don't really believe in democratic institutions. They think they're corrupted by big money. They think they're corrupted by partisan insiders who are, drawing these crazy shaped districts. Here in the state of New Hampshire, every Senate district we have is gerrymandered. And when they see this kind of thing happening, they lose confidence that democratic institutions can reflect the common sense of the citizenry. And I think we're going to need to undertake a wholesale reform of our democracy and put it into better shape. An earlier generation did this. They were called the progressives. And from the, a constitutional amendment that made an income tax constitutional, to the constitutional amendment that gave women the right to vote, to inventing things like political primaries and other institutions, they renovated American democracy for a new century. And I think it's time for a project on that scale, and I fully expect it to happen. So let me stop there.
We just got our first question, Russell.
Okay.
Could government regulation play a role on the gatekeeper role you mentioned?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So the big platform companies, of course, don't want any regulation, and I think that they're going to find themselves increasingly regulated in Europe if they can't perform this gatekeeping function in a satisfactory way on their own. I don't think it's going to happen in the U.S., but I think it's going to happen. It already is happening in the EU. So I think even the specter of a kind of regulatory web is going to motivate some change. I mean, our enemies are using these platforms to undercut the integrity, to undercut confidence in the electoral process. Foreign nations are, as we know, exploiting these platforms to do everything they can to undermine democracy, to make democracy look like an unworthy form of government. And so that their own people look at the United States and say, well, we don't want that. and thus the authoritarian rule in China and in Russia is that much more secure. So I think, I think if they don't succeed on their own, the government will look to try to invent some kind of regulatory web that might be effective. It's not easy. Part of the problem is technological. It's not just, you can't just put a bunch of producers or editors on Facebook.
I wonder, here comes another one. I deal personally with numerous conspiracy theory converts, and I find their mindset increasingly so convoluted and carved in stone that any and all attempts to present logic and evidence are exercises in frustration. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I'm really interested that Rachel has this personal experience with so many conspiracy theory converts, as she puts it. I mean, I'm kind of interested to hear more about why. I want to say that the population I'm really concerned about, the population that we're trying to address in this book, is not people who are in the grips of a conspiracy theory or those who have a conspiratorial mindset. Some people have a mindset so that they understand everything in terms of conspiracy. What we're really addressing are people who are bewildered by the blizzard of misinformation that's surrounding them, and we're hoping to address them and ratify and augment their common sense by, in part, just reminding them that what we're seeing here is not conspiracy theory. It's conspiracy without a theory. It's sheer assertion without any evidence. And just by prodding people's critical faculties, we hope to engage the information immune system, the misinformation immune system that we think citizens have. And so we're really addressing people who aren't, true believers. That's where I think the real danger is right now. And as for the subpopulation of true believers, you're right. But listen, persuading anybody to change their mind, even people who aren't, in a convoluted, say, self-affirming circle, in a non-falsifiable system of thought, is really, really difficult. It's really hard to change another person's mind. And I personally think that it's often better not to try. And rather than take on that persuasive project, if you're interested in dialoguing with somebody who is is in the grips of a conspiracy theory, I think it's more productive to take to follow the ethos of a dialogue, where what you try to do is just find out what people think and just ask them questions about what they think. And a question I like to ask, I was talking with a friend of mine who, everybody, by the way, believes in at least one conspiracy theory once in a while. It's not like, it's not an affliction that only happens to some people. Everyone's going to believe in a conspiracy theory now and then. And a friend of mine who's had convinced himself of a particular conspiracy theory involving, I think, the government's cover-up of unidentified flying objects, something like that. I asked him, I said, well, how, what kind of evidence would cause you to be less sure of what you think? And then I also asked him, like on a scale of 1 to 100, 0 to 100, how sure are you? Where 100 is, the certainty that, your phone number or your name. And 0 is like the certainty that you have about, I don't know, theoretical physics. and just, where are you? Like, are you, because most of my beliefs aren't at 100. Most of my beliefs, except for trivial ones, are, less than that. So, and if there's any uncertainty at all, then I, there's something to talk about. What makes you not, less than perfectly sure? If they're at 100, you say, wow, you're at 100. That's amazing. I'm not at 100 about very many things at all. It's incredible that you can be that confident, and maybe just leave it at that. But again, I think the task here is not to save those who have given themselves over to fantastic conspiratorial notions. It's to root those around them who haven't yet done that, but who find themselves a bit disoriented.
John, who is sitting with Rachel, has a comment, piggybacking on hers. I'm backing up to it. They seem to be frantically searching for simple solutions to complex realities.
Yeah, that might be right. I mean, I think. Well, again, I let's just put let's just put these conspiratorial notions into two different buckets. One are the ones that are really trying to explain a world that's hard to understand. And you might be right that the allure of certain conspiracy theories is that they offer a simplified explanation for something that's so complex it's ultimately really difficult to understand. At least that type of conspiracy theorist is in the world trying to explain the world. And then there's this other bucket where the whole purpose of the theory is to delegitimate the other side, the opposition in politics, or the government itself, and it's not trying to explain anything at all. It's just trying to fuel the partisan fight by raising people's certainty that their side is 100% right, and creating an opponent who becomes an existential foe, pure evil, an enemy, and so I think that these conspiratorial notions that are really political, that are about the partisan fight, those are the ones that right now Nancy and I are really, really worried about. The ones that, are really trying to explain the world, they could be cognitively defective, they could be bad explanations, they could be oversimplifications, or, like sometimes they'll be true. Who would have guessed that the CIA was actually experimenting in mind control techniques on its own, on the American citizenry? In a program called MK Ultra, and it was. So there is treachery, there is malfeasance, there is lying done by officials, done by the government, and who would guess that like a government would lie to its own people about the toxic quality of the water that they were drinking. And if somebody in Flint were entertaining a conspiracy theory about how the state government was colluding with local officials to deceive them about the quality of their water, well, they would have been right. So I guess, that simplification, you're right, that could be like a shortcut. It could be kind of an explanatory crutch, but at least there's an effort to explain. So I'm not opposed to conspiracy theory. I guess it's this conspiracy without the theory that's just trying to remake the world into friends and enemies who can't be tolerated. That's what I'm worried about.
Steve Roberts says, what about television news? Over-the-air stations, networks are held somewhat accountable, but what about Fox News and their part in propagating conspiracy, in quotes, news for the current administration?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that amazing? It's not just the social media that really is hard to, create a gatekeeping function for. I think there was an interesting moment last week on Fox News when Wallace said, wear the damn mask. Masks work, and said that the so-called scientific advisor who's advising Trump has no qualifications as an epidemiologist, and so yeah, that's something you don't hear a lot, and I think that's part of this recent development, really since 2016, where a whole raft of Republican elites and conservative elites seem to have just sold themselves over to Trump. I did not expect that to happen. I did not, say what I want about Fox News. I didn't expect them to be purveyors of conspiracism. And I didn't expect every governor and every senator, with the exception of maybe two, and so many members of Congress, to either stand aside in pure silence or to get on board with Trump.
We have another question from Heidi. In this age of technology, much more distanced from the natural world and real world experience, are we younger generations more susceptible to conspiracy thinking? What about the impact of the dizzy rate of change in the world? Does that set people up?
Yeah, that's good. I just chatted with a young, it was a high school student who was writing a story, for some publication, and was interested in exactly that question. Are young people more susceptible to this than older people. And the truth is, we just don't know yet. I mean, teaching young people, I guess I don't have a random sample of all young people in the country, but I'm in community with 20-year-olds as a professional matter. I don't find them any more likely to explain the world this way, or to buy into unfounded conspiratorial allegations than older people. I don't notice that their common sense, as it's sort of invigorated by contact with a shared world of events, of facts, of other people, that their common sense is somehow not there, as if they've just been looking at screens and only have very, very highly mediated access to a shared world. So I don't really. My hunch is that young people are not uniquely vulnerable to this. But I do worry. I do worry about an information world in which there are no authorities that can be trusted, and in that kind of disorienting situation, even very, very well-meaning people who are really making an effort to understand the world well, will find themselves pretty bewildered. And that's exactly the situation that authoritarians want to create, because a bewildered citizenry is a passive citizenry.
That is a scary thought. We have another question from Matt Harrison. Thanks, Russell. Couple of questions. One, can you speak to any connections between conspiratorial politics of today and the anti-Masonic party of the 1820s? And then do you want me to read the next one, or do you want to wait?
No, keep going.
And two, in these, quote, new conspiracy groups like QAnon, does it seem to you like these movements are more rooted somehow in religiosity or faith than previously conspiracy thought? End of the world, saviors, blind faith, etc., or has it always been part of it?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the anti-Masonic phenomenon, I think, really was motivated by a kind of fear of a secret elite that was, putatively had a great deal more control over events than it ever could have. And so I do think that if we look at that, or if we look at classic anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic conspiracism, which posits that there's a cadre of Jewish people who are secretly controlling events to the detriment of non-Jewish populations, I think what we see is the rationale for those authors of this book, American Conspiracy Theories, saying that conspiracy theory is for losers. These are people who, they're so far away from power that the exercise of it just remains fundamentally mysterious. And those who do exercise it remain, so distant that they feel completely locked out and completely alienated. And that then creates this sort of ripe condition for positing that there's some sort of elite that's controlling everything, and that's probably causing your misfortune. So I do think that's kind of the classic situation. I don't see that happening with QAnon. Yes, it posits that there's a liberal elite that's globalist, that doesn't like the United States, that's anti-Trump, but it's being posited by affiliates of the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, whose party controls the Senate and the Supreme Court. So this isn't powerless people on the outside trying to, inventing stories that make sense of how power works. These are very, very powerful people advancing a conspiracy theory, I think, for the sake of maintaining and expanding power. Just being used as a political tool, not as a way of kind of understanding your social location.
Right. One more question, it looks like, from Alex Brown regarding persuading/responding to people maintaining an extreme belief. Because the assertions are connected to establishing identity and tribal connection, conventional persuasion not only won't work, it could make it worse.
Right.
Only someone who specifically has a stake in the opposite of what he's recommending, i.e. a doctor saying that you don't need the surgery, will be believed. But I like the idea of challenging, quote, how sure are you?
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. That's right. So the direct effort to persuade, again, though, I've never been able to, I don't think I've ever persuaded anyone of anything ever. So I have, convictions about politics, and they're predictably liberal. And I've had any number, just lots of conservative friends over the years. And I've had so many discussions and arguments and debates, and I've never persuaded any of these friends of anything. It's really, really hard to persuade people. And, on the other hand, trying to understand why someone thinks what they do from a position of, if they are a friend, from a position of, sympathy and real curiosity, that can at least open up a little conversational space, but preserve the possibility of connection and friendship. And I think, with people with whom we disagree at this moment in time, when the bonds of our civic friendship are so frayed, I think that's actually a very good strategy for engaging people we disagree with, whether they're conspiracists or people we disagree with about other moral and political things. Because, we want to create a political life. We want to create a community where we can make politics together. And making politics means that we don't make war. It's the alternative to making war. Making politics means that we argue, we campaign, we disagree, but we live together. And at some level, we appreciate each other, even though we disagree so profoundly about so many things. And so I think, the most urgent thing of the moment is to somehow nourish those bonds of civic connection, whether it's family members who have beliefs that are radically different from one's own, or coworkers, or neighbors or friends. And it's the job isn't to persuade all those people so they agree with us or you or me or whatever. The job is to just open up some real space where we can hear each other, understand each other a little bit more fully, and maintain the kind of friendship in spite of our disagreement, because that's what making politics needs. And making politics, I think, is infinitely better than making war.